I'm Renee Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. Hi, I'm Renee Williams.
And I'm Billy Thomas.
And welcome to another edition of From the Woods Today. Hey, we're together.
I know, very exciting. It's really nice to be in person with you, Renee, and certainly glad to have all of you all with us today. We've got a really great show for you all. We've got a brand new guest I'm really excited about. We've got a new team member with us, Franny Preston. She's an invasive species outreach coordinator, and she's working with Dr. Springer and Dr. Crocker on some invasive species work. And she's going to be talking about kind of the impact of invasive species and wildlife a little bit. And since it's like World Wildlife Day, right?
Yeah, I think it's
coming up soon. We've got Dr. Springer is going to be talking about that. So we're really excited about having both these guests on. If you all have any questions for our presenters today, please use the chat function. If you're on YouTube, you can hit us up via email at forestry.extension@uky.edu. We can respond that way. But Renee, glad to be with you today in person in the studio. You know, yesterday from this very same space, you all put on an amazing show, Logger Web TV, right? We had over 300 master loggers across Kentucky get some training, and it was a really well done show. But we took advantage of the studio setup for that, so we're glad to come to you all from our studio here on the campus of the University of Kentucky.
Greatly appreciate it. But let's go ahead and get started. So, Franny, if you want to turn your camera on. Welcome to the show.
Yes. Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Good to have you, Franny. Thanks so much.
So tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about today.
Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about how invasive plants harm wildlife, because not only is World Wildlife Day coming up, but conveniently this week is also Invasive Species Awareness Week. So we kind of decided to combine both of them and show how they interact.
Excellent.
Wonderful. Looking forward to your presentation.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, first timer. I like it.
I know. I love it. Won't be the last.
No, for sure.
So again, I am the Invasive Species Outreach Coordinator, and I'm going to be talking about how invasive plants affect wildlife. I'm going to start kind of broad, but we're going to go over what is an invasive plant. So an invasive plant is an introduced non-native organism, or an invasive species is an introduced non-native organism. And this isn't just plants, it can also include diseases, parasites, or animals. And they are introduced to an area and they spread from that range, start causing harm. So that was a bit of a lengthy definition, but there's really two things you need to remember from that. Invasive plants are non-native. So when we're talking about Kentucky, they are not originally from Kentucky and they are causing harm. And they cause harm to a lot of different things, including native plants and even us, but we're going to talk about how they harm wildlife. So they do this by reducing food resources. So invasive plants come in and they outcompete some native plants. So if you're an herbivore animal, you've now got a lot less food to eat because the invasive plants have taken over. Now, not all animals eat plants, of course, but they might eat animals that eat plants. So invasive plants not only upset the herbivores' food resources, but they upset the whole food web. And animals don't just use plants for food, they also use them to live in or around. And when the invasive plants come in, they alter the wildlife's habitat. They can even change waterways. So some invasive plants are aquatic invasive and they're actually in the water and taking over and causing harm. But some of them might grow next to the water and make water even harder to access for different animals. So those are some of the ways just in general how invasive plants can harm wildlife, but just how bad is it? Well, a study was done to try and answer this question, and they looked worldwide at all these different invasive plants and different ecosystems affecting different animals. And you can see that invasive plants, if you look at kind of the left side of the chart, in general, they decrease the abundance, diversity, fitness, and ecosystem function of all these different animals and all these different ecosystems. Now, you might notice that it increased diversity in a couple different ecosystems, but even an increase is still changing the environment, so it's still detrimental. That was kind of an overview of what they do and how much of an impact they're causing. So now we're going to look at some specific examples of invasive plants harming wildlife. And we are going to go through some different vertebrate groups. We're going to start with birds. All right, so bush honeysuckle is an invasive plant that you're probably all too familiar with, even if you don't know it. It grows even in your backyards, but along the edge of the road, along the edge of the forest. And it's a shrub that can actually get pretty big, and it just completely takes over and outcompetes all the native plants. And this map on the left is from iNaturalist, and the little squares are reported sightings of bush honeysuckle. So you can see that there's a lot. Unfortunately, there is a lot of unreported honeysuckle as well. We're going to be talking about how bush honeysuckle affects some different bird species. So one of the biggest problems that it causes is that it increases nest predation. So a lot of these birds will lay their eggs, they'll build their nest in the bush honeysuckle bushes. And for whatever reason, whether it's the structure of the plant or their height from the ground, predators are able to access these nests a little bit easier. So that's decreasing the egg and hatchling survival. It also increases understory bird populations. So looking at the picture again, you can see all of the bushes right there are bush honeysuckle. So the whole understory was kind of created by the bush honeysuckle, thus helping out the understory birds like cardinals and robins become more prolific, which might be great for them, but it's not good for the canopy bird populations like eastern wood peewees. And so you can see it, even just this one invasive plant species is really causing some changes in population dynamics in this ecosystem. Now, honeysuckle is known for having some really tasty red berries that the birds do love to eat. And while this might seem great that it's providing a food source for them, it's not great long term because honeysuckle is outcompeting all of the other plants. And so while it might be a food source for them, it's decreasing the diversity of what they're allowed to eat. And so they're just going to be able to eat only one thing all the time. It's not good for nutrition. It changes the range specifically of understory birds. So where bush honeysuckle is invading, the understory birds can follow that and it's changing their range. And along those lines, it also can change their migration patterns. So a few studies have found that they are hanging around a little bit longer than they normally would in places where honeysuckle is invaded because the honeysuckle still has berries. And this is having some harmful effects on the birds themselves and then also their functions in the ecosystems where they're supposed to be migrating to. All right, so let's talk about an example now with mammals. And we're going to move out of southeastern United States and we're going to move to southeastern Africa because invasive plants are all over the world. So this is a plant called thoroughwort, and it's actually native to Central and South America, and it kind of grows as a shrub there, but where it's invasive, it grows really thick and a really even bigger shrub. And so we've got a map there. You can see where it has been reported in southeastern Africa, and you can see it's pretty dense along the coast. So this study was showing how thoroughwort was harming large African mammals on a reserve in South Africa. And overall, it reduced the land use by these large mammals. So, habitat loss is already a problem. And then these invasive plants are pushing these animals, such as water buffalo, even further out and giving them less room to roam. And it also changes where the predators were hunting. So the prey animals were avoiding these areas with thoroughwort because they were really dense, shrubby vegetation and they didn't feel safe. And the predators were taking advantage of that. And they're like, hey, these are great hiding spots, so I'm going to hang out here. Again, for the herbivore animals, it is having a long-term effect on the plants because it is outcompeting all of the native plants. And then the herbivorous mammals, they are losing a lot of their food resources. Now, reptiles might be an interesting group to think about with as being affected by invasive plants, but unfortunately, they didn't come out unscathed either. Now, this study was done with one of my favorite types of snakes, copperheads, and it was just kind of overall looking at some invasive plants and how they affected the copperheads. And reptiles, such as snakes, they are ectothermic or cold-blooded. They regulate their body temperature based on where they can go in the environment. So if they're too cold, they'll go sit on a hot rock, or if they're too hot, they might go crawl into the shade for a little bit. And this study found that where the invasive plants it was changing the environmental temperatures at the ground level. So this can be really harmful because these snakes might be running out of different places to be able to regulate their body temperature, and that can be pretty dangerous. Again, they changed the plant composition, and while the copperheads aren't eating any of the plants, we'll talk about a couple ways that this is affecting them. So they were found to avoid the areas infested by invasive plants. And there's a couple of reasons that they could have been doing this. One, they might not have been able to hide as well from their prey items like mice, and they might not have been able to hide from the animals that were actually looking to eat them. And so they were kind of avoiding these areas infested by invasive plants. And again, that's decreasing where they are able to be safe. So not only is this affecting the copperheads, but it's affecting their whole food web that they're involved with as well. And perhaps most importantly, it impacts the reproduction. So in this study, they found that the copperheads were less likely to have their babies under invasive plant cover rather than native plant cover. So again, that's less places that they can add to the population, and is ultimately really harming their species. And finally, we'll talk about amphibians. So amphibians are the most at-risk group for extinction worldwide. So it's really important that we mitigate invasive plants for all of the different animal groups, but especially for amphibians, we got to figure out what kind of problems the invasive plants are causing and then also how to fix it. All right, so we're bringing back bush honeysuckle, and this is a bit of an interesting study. So in this study, they looked at how bush honeysuckle leaves, when they decomposed in the water, how it affected amphibian species. So every amphibian species, this includes frogs, toads, salamanders, and others, they have to spend at least a little bit of their life, not all of their life, in the water. And when leaves decompose in the water, they release different chemicals, which with the native plants, they're fine. These species are already adapted to that. But with some invasive plants, such as bush honeysuckle, can actually cause some harm. So in this study, essentially what they did is kind of made teas out of bush honeysuckle leaves and then native plant leaves in different ponds. And they put some toad tadpoles in these different ponds. And unfortunately, they found that there was a survival decrease for these tadpoles when they were raised in the honeysuckle leaf water. It was so bad, it was almost by half. And so if you look, the bottom line with the circle dots, the Lonicera, that's the honeysuckle. And that's their survival rate when they were growing up in that, compared to the native leaves, the square line at the top. So you can see that the honeysuckle really impacts their survival rate. Now, this was, of course, in a lab setting, but in the wild, if honeysuckle is the only plant in the area, it's releasing all of the different leaves into these little ponds. It's really going to harm the amphibians. All right, so that was a lot of doom and gloom, which unfortunately invasive species is a lot of doom and gloom. However, it's not all like that. It's not all negative, because we actually can make a difference and do something about it. So every single one of us can help stop invasive plants, and we're going to talk about a few ways how. So the best way to stop invasive plants is by making sure they don't get into an area in the first place. And this can look like a couple different things. So if you go hiking or you go boating or maybe you go off-roading with your vehicle, invasive plants are pretty much everywhere, but especially if you know that you're in a spot with some invasive plants, make sure to clean off your shoes, make sure to clean off your equipment. That way you're not transporting seeds or other different plant parts and spreading these invasive plants. Another way to prevent the spread of invasive plants is by not planting them in your yard. Now, this sounds pretty simple. However, invasive plants are still sold pretty widespread. And so if you're looking to add some new plants to your garden, just do some research on it first and see if there is a non-invasive or native alternative that you can plant instead. There's lots of great options out there to find some alternatives to plant instead, and your yard and the environment will both thank you. Second up, we've got monitoring invasive species. So if you remember the couple of maps that I showed, those were from iNaturalist. And if you haven't used iNaturalist before, you can report any plant or animal or fungus or pretty much anything you find on there. And it's really helpful for researchers and managers, specifically with invasive plants, to know just how widespread they are and where they are. And so every person, when you're out hiking in the woods and you see some honeysuckle, you can stop, post a picture of it on iNaturalist, and you've just helped contribute to scientists knowing where these plants are. And you can also do that with EdMaps, and that is a site that is specifically for invasive plants. And finally, remove them if you can. If you can remove the invasive plants from your backyard, plant some different alternatives, or even find some volunteer groups to help remove them from your local parks or maybe some other natural areas. And removing them and managing them is going to look different for each species. So it might require some herbicides, it might require some physical control, but thankfully there's a lot of resources online that you can find about controlling them. So again, we can each do our part by preventing, monitoring, and removing these invasive plants, and each one of us can help save wildlife this way. So I appreciate you all listening and learning today about invasive plants harming wildlife. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. But real quick, if any of you all are really enthusiastic about invasive plants or really enthusiastic about education, we've got some workshops coming up about invasive plant education. And so there's one in Fayette County, Boone County, and McCracken County. You can sign up for them by scanning the QR code with your phone, or you can send me an email. My email is listed down below. And thanks again.
Excellent.
Wonderful.
And I really appreciate your time and the presentation you put together. I think, a lot of us that come to work in this realm, we think about invasive species all the time, right? But I don't know that the public always does. So I think, the efforts that you're doing, including this presentation, those trainings are really critical, right? To raise that awareness. And, one thing I will mention, we have a lot of woodland owners that enjoy this show and check out the show. And I would just remind them that they have access to some hands-on assistance on their property, right? Working with their foresters, their wildlife biologists, their NRCS staff. Those folks can not only help them identify those plants out there, but Renee, they can actually show them how to remove them, and in certain instances, get some money to them to help pay for those
Exactly.
expenses. So make sure if you're a landowner out there and this is something you're dealing with, you're working with these professionals. They'll make your life a lot easier and they'll help you get the work done. So, Franny, I'm so excited to have you on the team and the work that
Thank
you're
you.
doing here. And and I know we'll have her on.
Oh, I definitely plan to. Yes, I think I actually have already booked for next month.
Yeah.
Oh, we just got a question in. Let me pull that up. That says when you remove bush honeysuckle, the additional light that reaches the florist floor will cause winter creeper to explode. What is the best control measure for winter creeper?
It sounds like McConnell Springs in Lexington, Kentucky.
It does,
right there.
really,
Very similar
yes.
situation.
Mhm.
Yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the invasive plants can work together in a way. And when you've got one, you've got a bunch of them. So for winter creeper, for smaller invasions, like in your backyard, if you just have a few trees surrounded by them, you can even just hand pull them. Make sure especially to cut and pull the climbing vines, because those are the ones that fruit and spread more. if there's big infestations, foliar or herbicide is honestly the best route to go.
But again, I think working with a professional and,
Mhm.
and I think people have to remember that, this is a repeated effort often, right? It's
Yeah.
rarely just one time and
Right.
you treat it and you walk away.
Mhm.
Because unfortunately they're
And you have to
perceived.
be careful with some invasives. You do it wrong and you just make them mad and they come back even worse.
Yeah.
It's like you have to know what you're doing. Yes, exactly. So getting that kind of professional person who knows what they're doing to help you can
Right.
help out a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
Mhm. Save you a lot of time.
No doubt. No doubt. Um, all right. It looks like we had another question, but I'm not sure it's for you, Franny. There was a question. Is there a plan to treat the invasives that entomology is locating within the Citizen Science Project? I don't know if you're familiar with that effort or not.
I'm familiar with it. I'm not sure the answer to the question
Okay.
though.
Yeah, no worries there. We can follow up with that person
Mhm.
and get a response back to them.
Yeah. All right. Well,
All right.
thank you again for your presentation.
Yeah, Franny, great job. Another first timer.
Uh-huh.
So glad to have you on. Really appreciate it,
I
Franny.
appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll see you again.
Yep. All right.
All right.
Up next.
Dr. Springer's in the house. Yeah. Hey, Matthew, how are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you? And I see Shad's comment there in question, and I believe there is a valiant effort in place to go after the other invasive that's associated with tree of heaven. I don't believe there's a whole lot of focus right now on actually treating the tree of heaven that's reported outside of, hopefully the landowners that are there can get in contact with folks to get that in place.
Right, just being aware that it's there could be valuable in itself.
Yeah.
So,
Yep. And unfortunately, I think with that one specifically, we're going to see a Christmas tree light up kind of situation when that starts, getting reported heavily and complications associated with treating all of that. So,
no, no,
Mhm.
lovely.
Yeah.
But you're here to talk about World Wildlife Day, right? Coming up on March 3rd.
Mhm.
yeah. So let's get onto some happier news, I guess, and talk about some of the great, diversity that we have in terms of wildlife. Present, I'm focusing on the state of Kentucky since that's what we call home. Obviously, there's a lot more that's out there that's being celebrated. And I will say that World Wildlife Day is not just for wildlife. They also had it's for wildlife and plants
Oh,
officially. But
go
we
tree.
can ignore the they're not that important.
Hey, oh, Matt, you know this. Many of our landowners here in Kentucky, they own their land with a really of a primary interest and focus in wildlife. So,
Mhm.
appreciate the work you do. Kind of looking out for wildlife and keeping us educated on all the issues related to wildlife here in Kentucky. Thank you.
I try to do my best, and I fail horribly, but I try.
Oh,
Well, there's
you
just
did
a lot
a
to
great job.
keep up with, no doubt, for sure.
However, they all go hand in hand in healthy ecosystems, healthy forests equal healthy wildlife populations.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. All right. So I guess I'm going to jump into this,
Go for it.
and hopefully things are showing up here.
That's
Everyone
that's
sees
good.
that amazing looking green salamander right there. That is a pretty cool amphibian that we have present in the state of Kentucky. So as Billy mentioned, World Wildlife Day is on Sunday, March 3rd. So I took this as an opportunity to kind of just highlight some of the amazing diversity that we have within the state of Kentucky, specifically on the wildlife side. That extends to trees, all 120 tree species and shrubs and other plants, ephemerals that are about to be popping up and awesome to go on those walks here. Very short, potentially right now, based on the weather we're having. So just gonna focus a little bit on some of the wildlife that we have, and many of which you may have never even heard of or knew existed in our state, because we have so many of them. So kind of break this down, right? So we have our and I threw in some abnormal things I don't talk about. So go be nice to me on questions because they are outside of my expertise. Usually, hand in hand, I'm a wildlife biologist. There's fishery biologists that actually focused on the ones on the right side of this screen here. But they do fall within the management of Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. So I wanted to make sure, they're considered wildlife under the definition of non-domesticated vertebrate species, or invertebrate, depending on, throw the mussels and snails in there. So, we've got a huge number of species present. Well over 1,000 different species fall within the management of Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. So to highlight some of the ones that we have here, oh man, I see an error, typo here. Specifically, we have 57 amphibians, primarily made up of salamanders in the state of Kentucky. We are in #2 state in the United States in terms of salamander diversity, behind North Carolina, with 35 different salamander species. And on top of that, we have 22 frog and toad species here in Kentucky. We do not have 248 mammals. That would be pretty awesome if we did, though. They are the cute and cuddly ones out of this entire bunch, I would say. We are much lower than that. It's supposed to read 48, of which 27 are small mammals and include 16 different bat species identified in the state of Kentucky, and 14 of which are considered permanent residents. The Brazilian long-tailed bat is occasional, pops in, and there's some other ones that are kind of intermittently around. We have well over 350 species of birds that will give or take make an appearance here in the state, including some really odd ones that we recently had, right? So we had the flamingos that were here after the hurricane a couple months ago. They would not fall into what we would normally say is a bird within Kentucky. But the great thing about birds is they're incredibly mobile. So you may have some really fun ones that pop in on occasion. However, most of our birds we have group into three main categories. We have our residents, things like cardinals, cedar waxwings, red-tailed hawks that are here year-round. Then we get into our spring migrants, our neotropical migrants that are about to start showing up, like shown here, which is our Kentucky warbler. So I threw that picture on there as a highlight of our species. And many other warbler species and migrants that are going to pop in. Well over 150 species that would fall into this category. And then we get into some of the winter residents that actually are migrating to spend the winter here in Kentucky from the north. And we see a few species. That one's a little bit smaller in number. However, things like waterfowl is a great example of winter migrants that we see that spend their time in our state to basically bide their time until they head back north again. The next group there that I have is our reptiles. We have 56 species present within this group, including 10 lizard species, 32 different snake species, and not all of them are venomous, only 4, and then 14 different turtle species. So they're a pretty diverse group. And the species I have pictured here is the mud snake. It is not a commonly seen species. It's mostly located out in western Kentucky, in the floodplains of the Mississippi. However, it is a rather large species that you'd have to go searching under logs that are partially submerged to find them. But it is about a 4-foot long species that has this vibrant red belly to it. Really interesting and colorful snake. Finally, we get into some of our fish, and this is where I'm getting out of my realm here. We have almost 250 fish species within the state of Kentucky, and about 68 of those, unfortunately, are identified as species of greatest needs for management. We have a huge, diverse group of darters, our smaller species. Often we think of things like that muskie that's pictured there, or walleye or sauger, something like that in terms of game species. But the diversity really lies into the little guys, especially those that live in very small streams. Specifically things like the Kentucky arrow darter that you'll see later that are found in just a small area of the state that are doing quite well in that area. You're just really kind of endemic to a very small spot. And probably one of the most the group that brings the most to the table in Kentucky relative to other places here is that last group, the mussels and aquatic snails. We have about 103 species of mussels present. Unfortunately, this is also a group that we probably lost a lot of our species. Some may have never even known. But in this group, there's about 36 that are considered rare or endangered right at this point in time. And that number is going to be increasing, including 27 that are considered threatened or endangered species, with 2 more that are potentially going to be listed. So this is one, right, with that aquatic environment and the potential nutrient loads and the alterations from the anthropogenic activities, they took a big hit. And a lot of problems there. The cool thing is that we have the Mussel Lab that's hosted by the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, as well as partnerships with U.S. Forest Service. We have some of the world leaders in mussel work right here in the state, doing some amazing things, trying to keep these species around and conserve them for future generations. Now, the next part. Unfortunately, we have lost a lot of our species present in the state, some completely, others just we lost range restrictions. So probably the most notable from the wildlife perspective that, with given Audubon's relationship to the state, the passenger pigeon and the long history of the passenger pigeon with the Ohio River, Kentucky River, and how those flocks would just turn the sky black. There are so many of them. They were the meat market, unfortunately, took a very big toll on them. They also had a weird little behavior where they needed a colony size that was over a certain amount to initiate breeding. And once that number fell below that, then there was nothing we could do to ensure the survival of the species. Some subspecies that we also lost in the state, including the eastern elk, which we no longer have. So the elk that we have present in the state are actually Rocky Mountain elk. They're not the same animals that existed here back in prior to European colonization. Same kind of goes for the eastern cougar, mountain lion. That we have a small subspecies that lives and resides down in South Florida, and then we have the western species that is kind of creeping further and further east in the Dakotas and Nebraska and the Black Hills, and Iowa and Missouri seem to have a lot more frequent visitors from those populations. But our species that was here, our subspecies that was here, has been gone for many decades. More recently, especially with speaking of forest health pests, the pine beetle, we lost the red cockaded woodpecker. It was holding on down in the southern part of our state for all the way up into the 90s. And unfortunately, with the forest structure that they need, we lost that due to the die-off of several of the pine trees. So they are still alive and well further south. They're not doing great in some places. They seem to be pretty stable, but we do not have them in Kentucky anymore. Some larger species like bison that were huge drivers of our ecosystems, especially here in the bluegrass, we no longer have present either, as much of their range has shrunk, right? So there's only very few places where you have free ranging bison anymore. Some other bird species that are lost completely. Historically, we probably had the ivory-billed woodpecker, especially out in further western part of the state, in the cypress swamps. The Carolina parakeet, greater prairie chicken was also located in parts of the state that were originally prairie. We lost a lot of our prairie areas. And then getting into this, swallow kite, swallowtail kite, and then several other mussels that we lost, like the yellow blossom, the winged maple leaf. So unfortunately, we would have been more diverse, as are most places. However, we're still doing pretty good. And a lot of that is actually, being managed and maintained because of the mantra that wildlife biologists have: build it and they will come, field of dreams, right? All those activities are really under this idea that these species require habitat, and if you create and manage that habitat, especially in the altered landscape that we live in, an active management mentality is needed. That we're trying to make sure there's habitat present to support these species so that they're around for future generations to enjoy. A lot of our previous work has been spent trying to prioritize individual species. That still occurs, especially with our threatened and endangered species that are listed. However, there's been a paradigm shift where we've really started focusing on trying to work on ecosystem health, ecosystem connectivity, using umbrella species to help achieve those goals. Ideally, those umbrella species are usually more charismatic and can reach landowners to help them kind of engage with the idea of needing these species around, and then it also benefits a lot of others. One of the specific ones that we use a lot for grasslands are bobwhite quail. It's a great umbrella species for grassland birds. It's not perfect, but it helps promote habitat conditions that favor a lot of species that are declining because of habitat loss and the loss of grasslands and early successional habitat in general. So that's kind of where we are moving in terms of trying to make sure we have a lot of these species around in the future. And there's a lot of active habitat management that goes on, and that takes a wide variety of forms, from fire to herbicides, to logging, to even farming practices in some extents, grazing practices that help maintain early successional habitat. And one of not being a native Kentuckian, being from Pennsylvania, one of the things that I find really amazing about this state is the reason we have so many species. Why do we have so many species in the state of Kentucky? Well, it comes to the fact that there's so much going on in our state from east to west, in terms of topography, in terms of the eco regions that we have, that allow for different habitat structure, plant diversity, the soil types. All of that plays a role where we have a huge diversity of habitats, which equals a diversity of species that reside in them. So I kind of wanted to take this chance to walk us through some of those habitat types that are really kind of unique, that you'll find only certain species within them, to try to highlight basically parts of our state that have wonderful things going on in terms of the wildlife world. We'll start off initially with right here, centrally located, and where we're at right now as we do this show, the bluegrass region. And this is probably one of the most all in general, the most heavily altered landscapes. So we see many of the species that would have been here prior to European colonization and development as we move along, industrial revolution, all that. So we would have had a lot of savannas, and actually we would have had a lot of cane breaks present along our riparian areas, so much so that they could have been 3 to 5 miles wide off of our stream systems. That in itself is our native cane has really gone away. There's some remnants in certain places, so we lost a lot of the species that were there. We would probably have things like swamp rabbits even all the way up in our bluegrass region. A lot of the savannas were going to be maintained by the bison that were here. So now we have a lot of species that do quite well in agricultural or human dominated landscapes. These ones are generally early successional species that live in brushy areas in and around developments, as well as those that are kind of more generalists, things like the garter snake, the snapping turtle that can kind of deal with a lot of human activity and still have success. I have the eastern towhee is present here. It's one of my favorite shrubland birds, and it's one that I see on a fairly regular basis, even in landscapes. That holds true, which, a lot of our landscape isn't that savanna. It's not the patchy habitat. It's a lot more of, horse farms, human developments, and these are the species that we see there, right? So robins are doing wonderful. They do quite well in lawn-dominated landscapes with 1 or 2 places to nest around. They succeed. Other species like the gray rat snake or black rat snake do great. And then we have the ones that maybe we don't want to succeed so well, but they're doing it. Things like the striped skunk, which, by the way, you probably are noticing that there's quite a few of them hit on the road right now. It is striped skunk mating season, so they're out and about looking for love. Valentine's Day kicks in, it gives them a bug. And then we also have a raccoon who can pretty much live anywhere there's a trash can, and they know how to get into it, even if you lock it down. So they're obviously one of the ones that does really well in human dominated landscapes. Moving on, kind of down the interstate a little bit, we get into one of the most diverse areas, especially as it relates to aquatic diversity and mussel diversity, with South Central Kentucky, the Green River. In this area, we have a very karst kind of geology, which presents its own little landscape of pop-up springs and caves. It promotes a lot of birds. There's been a lot of conservation activity down there as it relates to the CREP program, the early 2000s and up till about 5 years ago. That program really brought about a lot of grassland conservation. The bobwhite quail and many grassland birds have responded quite well to those areas. Huge amount of mussel diversity within the river itself. There's also a lot of bats that use that area. Specifically, the gray bat is down there. That's not as common in the rest of the state, but has a pretty good breeding stronghold in that region. And there's a lot more other conservation activities kind of keep these going on, even including acts of Congress to remove dams. work spearheaded by several groups, but TNC has done a lot of work down there to try to promote that biodiversity conservation because it's such an important area. And in general, that cave mentality and all that or cave presence and karst geology is really neat, and it allows a lot of different species to succeed down there, along with making a really cool tour to go out and check it out and go look for those wildlife and go see some really neat stuff while you're at it. Mammoth Cave and that area is a wonderful day spent to go enjoy wildlife on March 3rd if you can. Other cool areas that are a little bit smaller in size relative to the rest of the state is far western Kentucky. And this is getting into the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. So I'm talking cypress swamps right along the Mississippi River there, and a few of those feeder streams that go into it. So far west Kentucky, it kind of, that Mississippi Alluvial Valley comes up all the way from the Gulf Coast there, and it produces a very specific type of habitat structure, floodplain kind of situation that has really interesting wildlife call it home. This is the area you're going to see the most waterfowl in the state of Kentucky and the most diverse number of species because of that flooding system in terms of the food opportunities it presents within wetlands that are created, as well as the fact that it kind of is right at the line where freeze happens on the waterway. So the birds come down. That's kind of in many years, that's the line that they get to in terms of making it through winter. That's as far south as they have to go. Other animals that are out there that you don't see in other places, it has now become the stronghold. That part of the state has become the stronghold for armadillo immigration into the north. They have had a pretty good stronghold of that species for a while now. And if you drive around out there in the summer, especially the further west you go, west of the land between lakes, you will see armadillos hit on the side of the road pretty regularly. There's also a lot of snake species and amphibians that are out there that you will not see in most other parts of the state, including several different water snakes that we do not see anywhere else. Right next to it, and it kind of transitions nicely away from the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, but still staying in this bottomland hardwood forest ecosystem where you have no topography. You get a lot of flooding near the riparian areas, the stream systems. This presents a really neat habitat type that allows very specific wildlife to take advantage of it. Things that we see here that we don't see at least at the densities that we see out in Western Kentucky are things like the prothonotary warbler. There's a few others that are higher densities. We have prothonotarians here throughout the state. You just see them more frequently out there because that flooded habitat is just more abundant with the lack of topography. The lesser siren is found out that way, and further west into the Mississippi Alluvial Valley, we have the swamp rabbit that still has a stronghold in this bottomland hardwood system. That is the rabbit that did attack Jimmy Carter on a boat during his little adventure one day on holiday. So they are a species that uses the flooded area of the forest to evade predators. So they go swimming to avoid their prey instead of just running around in circles like the eastern cottontail does, the one that we see here in our backyards. This is also kind of the edge of the range for the cottonmouth. It does come a little further east, but for the most part, you're talking about Owensboro, Henderson, County, and west is where you'll see them in terms of snakes. Transitioning east to the things that we generally talk about a lot more because there's a lot more forest there. However, also really cool, we get into the Appalachian Mountains and many of the species and topography that comes with that. And there's a lot there. We think more of our charismatic large mammals are on this side, right? So things like our restored elk population, our black bears. But we also see a lot of bird species on this side of the state that you will not see in other places. This is the location where we have things like the golden-winged warbler at high altitude being for Kentucky. We also see a lot more diversity of our salamanders over here because of the small watersheds that exist that potentially cause isolation and then evolution into individual species. I kind of flew through some bigger regions here, but there's a lot more out there. I just encourage you as the nice weather kicks in, get out there, go explore, go see more wildlife, go experience these species for yourself. We have a diverse number of ecosystems present in the state. You can find something to see regardless where you go. Even, we've got a bird feeder outside our building right here, and there's some birds that I get excited to see even now. So, use what you have, go out, enjoy the diversity that we have, get to those ecoregions, go for a nice hike, take in some of the great joys of natural resources we have here in the state of Kentucky. I kind of highlighted several species. There's some that are great restoration stories, including things like the peregrine falcon pictured here. I kind of touched on the Kentucky darter already. But there's others that are not doing so great. Our bat species are very much in decline, and then our eastern hellbender, which is our largest salamander, is really not doing good across its entire range. So to some extent, we've got a huge diversity of species, but we got a lot of work to do to make sure that we maintain that diversity moving forward. And every little bit helps. As Franny said, don't battle those invasives. They don't help. Do some habitat work in terms of promoting native systems, native ecosystems. Get some natives in your yard. Even that has a big effect on even our migratory songbirds. I went out to my garden the other day and looked at all my coneflowers, and there's not a single seed left on my coneflowers because the finches took care of all of them. So with that, I'm going to transition into something real quick, and Renee and Billy may get mad at me, but it's all related to wildlife and managing wildlife. And that's the fact that it's warming up, baby season's coming, and there's a few things that we want to make sure we emphasize here. Keep the wild and wildlife, right? So make sure that as you potentially encounter newborn wildlife species, babies, wildlife, that you really remember that many species kind of have different plans for how they want their babies to survive and how the babies act in order to help them survive, whether that's fawns where they hide and don't move, or it could be things like rabbits that are left alone all but for one moment of the day. Mom runs in, feeds them, and runs away. Or it could be fledgling birds that pop out of a nest that you think should still be in a nest, but they don't, and they know better. So remember that, the best thing you can do is leave wildlife be and let them sort it out for themselves. If you really, really feel like you need to contact someone to ask questions, there are resources out there, including an entire list set up by Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources for wildlife rehab facilities that all have to kind of be regulated. If you go to the website on Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, they have a list of the rehabbers that exist, where they are and what they specialize in, and as well as contact information. But remember that wildlife belong in the wild. And there's many regulatory statutes that confirm that lawfully, including those associated with transporting and holding of wildlife. There's also local governments that have been empowered to make their own regulations, especially those related to rabies vectors. We do not want to be dealing with species that carry rabies, moving species around, and in general don't want to move species around because of the diseases that they carry and potential harm that it causes for public health. So with that, I will happily take any questions.
Well, thank you, Matt. We greatly appreciate that. And that hellbender cracked me up. He's like laying on his back. It looked like he's sunning underwater. So thank you for your presentation. We greatly appreciate that. And if anybody has any questions, you can type them in the chat pod or send them to forestry.extension@uky.edu.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate your ending there, Matt. I mean, I know we were talking about World Wildlife Day coming up on March 3rd, but it's a great reminder for folks because as we start getting out with the warmer weather, people are out checking their property. You may encounter some of these baby wildlife. So you want to but as Dr. Springer told us, we need to let them be, right? Let them do their thing and they'll figure it out, which can be hard for people that are well-meaning, right? They really want to try to help. They're trying to do something good, but I think now that they know that they should leave them alone, hopefully they'll be, more likely to do so.
Especially when your dog digs up a rabbit, and you're like, oh, leave that alone. So, yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of times especially rabbits, squirrels are really commonly encountered. If you leave them be in that area that they were in, mom will find them and bring them back. So it's, and unfortunately, especially with mammals, even when you get them to rehabber, because of the imprinting component that goes into that, releasing from a rehabber is very difficult and sometimes, and a lot of times impossible. So in many ways, we may be creating a bigger problem than solving. The good thing is, especially with birds, that's not as true. Many bird species, they don't imprint like they do. So there's a little bit more positive outcome from bird rehab than there is mammal rehab. But unfortunately, birds, usually the ones that get brought to rehabbers, would have been fine without it because their mom is like watching you take that bird away. So you just leave them be. If they're hopping around, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing.
God.
All right. Well, again, thank you, Dr. Springer. We appreciate you being on today, and I'm sure I will have you back again.
No doubt. Yeah. Certainly the work you do is so important to so many people here in Kentucky. So thank you.
All right. Great show.
In the studio,
Yeah.
too. Pretty exciting.
Yeah, love having you togetherness. That's wonderful.
It was really nice, but certainly we appreciate our audience. Right?
Definitely.
Thank you all so much for being with us today. We had a great turnout. We really appreciate you all. Certainly thank Franny, a new guest. Appreciate having her on, and we'll see her again.
Definitely.
And as always, Dr. Springer does such a good job. So yeah, thank you all though for being with us. We're here every Wednesday at 11. We'd love to have you back. If you know of others who might appreciate this show, let them know about it, right? We're trying to promote and help support good forestry and wildlife management of our natural resources here in Kentucky. So anything we can do to try to, reach more people, we're trying to do so. So I know many of you all are very passionate about the environment and you really care about Kentucky. So help us kind of spread that word however we can.
Yeah. And all of our shows are on fromthewoodstoday.com.
Which has got a revamp, right?
Yes, it did. It did. We might show that next week just to kind of show that.
Yeah.
But we have redone our website, so they're a totally new look. And we're getting to a process of like doing keywords and things like that, so you can search for episodes. We're still in that because we have a lot of shows out there.
We really do.
So but we're in that process, and so it should be an easier site to navigate.
No doubt, and that's a great reminder, Renee. There is so much content on there, right? Maybe you've got a question about this or that. You may have this and that there. So so check it out. Yeah, so appreciate you all, but check it out and let others know about it. And thank you all for being with us each week. We greatly appreciate it.
And we will see you next Wednesday at 11. Take care.
Bye everyone.
From the woods today.